Yeah, can everyone please mute themselves?
There we go. Awesome. Thank you very much. They say there's kind of the two worst times to do a presentation are the second worst is immediately before dinner, and the worst is actually during the dinner hour. So I'm grateful to be here, and I'm thankful that everybody that's participating is spending an hour with me instead of their dinner, or maybe with me and their dinner at the same time. So thank you very much for hosting me on this. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of things, and as mentioned earlier, feel free to put something in the chat. And if somebody could just raise their hand and ask a question, that works just as well for me. I can't see the chat from where I am here right now. So feel free to raise your hand, or if the hosts could just ping me with a question, that'd be great. So let's get started. Oh, by the way, here, if you want to reach out to me and contact me, here's my contact information. We do have a Substack, pretty popular, quite a few subscribers, and it has the book summary, but it also takes off where the book ends, and it talks a lot about what we're talking about today, except in much, much more detail. We also have a podcast that you should feel free to take a look at. The Substack is free. All of our articles, and there's quite a lot of them, are free, so feel free to participate. Would love to have you on board and share some feedback. So a little bit about me. Written 2 books with O'Reilly implementing data mesh and the agentic mesh, which is really about the agent ecosystem we're going to talk about today. I won't bore you with all the details about myself, but as mentioned, I've been in the industry for a long time. And for the last 10 years have been running my own boutique consulting company. We help large firms build ecosystems. Back in the day, it was APIs and service mesh. Then it was data products and data mesh. And for the last, I'm going to say 3 years, give or take, a little bit longer than that, we have been focused on agents and the agent ecosystem and what we call the agentic mesh. I'm not hung up on the term, but suffice to say, we help firms today accelerate their agent journey, and we are building agent ecosystems right now with a variety of companies. Here's the summary. If there's one slide that you want to take a look at, this is what I'm going to talk about, and these are some of the key messages. So I'll elaborate and go through this very quickly. But what we've seen is, and hopefully you've seen some of this too, perhaps, is data engineering gets stuck in the gears, whether it's bottlenecks, can't have access to the experts, drifting definitions, hard to get the business information that you need, weak feedback loops. Bottom line is we know that there's some challenges. However, what we're finding is that agents, things like Claude Code or Codex, less so OpenClaw, but those type of agents are today changing software engineering. They're going to do the same for data engineering. The challenge that we see is, if you believe Jensen Huang, Andy Jassy, Satya Nadella, CEOs of huge companies, arguably the industry leaders, what they're saying is that there's not going to be 1 or 10 or even 1,000 agents in every company. There's going to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, even billions, according to Andy Jassy. Even if they're really wrong, what we're talking about is a lot of agents. The question is not how do you build or deploy one agent on my desktop and what can I do with it, but how do I actually bring these agents together in a collaborative fashion so they work together, they can find each other and safely collaborate, interact, and transact. That's the power of the ecosystem. That's going to be the focus of what we're talking about. As agents come together with data, specifically data products, not to overuse that terminology, but when I say data products, it's any domain bounded context of data, however it may be implemented in whatever connotation you may want. But when you combine them with agents, what you get is smart data products. Agents can help you build your data products. They can be embedded in your data products, and agents will consume your data products. So agents today will not and cannot and should not be separated from the data that they act upon. This data is accessible through an agentic knowledge fabric, kind of a cool phrase, I suppose, but ultimately it captures the institutional knowledge and serves that information for agents. It provides the minimum viable context required for agents to do their job in a token aware or token budget aware fashion. Last but not least, trust Nobody's going to deploy these things in any way, shape, or form unless they trust what the agents can actually do and what they will do. Starts with identity, zero trust posture, as well as things like observability. And if you put all those together, what you get is the emerging enterprise agent ecosystem. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with do a little bit of myth busting and observations. This is based off of our experience with many clients and dialogues that I was just in Europe actually last week speaking on this exact topic. And what's safe to say is that everyone wants to use agents, okay, but it's a myth. If you listen to X or formerly Twitter, if you look at even Substack, or you look at Medium, or even LinkedIn, it seems like everybody's using these agents. That's not true. Every enterprise that we see, whether it's in North America, Europe, or elsewhere, they are at the earliest stages of using agents. So you're not behind. Maybe your enterprise is. We have not seen any enterprise, and we've talked to quite a few that are using agents broadly yet. Everybody's dipping their toes in. So you're not behind yet. But as you can tell by the hype, implementation will follow that hype. So we definitely foresee agents moving into the enterprise. The problem that we see right now, though, is the vast majority of these companies that are building agents or using agents, they're building what we call science experiments in the sense that they never get out of the lab and into production. There's always some problems. I think somebody called it proof of concept purgatory is the other word that's been used. And we think there's a few fundamental reasons, and we'll talk about some of those today. The third observation or myth is that few people today understand the differences between what we call coding agents or personal agents. So coding agents would be Claude Code, Codex, personal agents, OpenClaw. And the difference between those and enterprise agents, they are related. They are different, especially as you start to think about some of the enterprise grade capabilities that agents will need as they move into the enterprise. So what's the primary obstacle to success? We don't see too many people actually understand what it takes to get through the enterprise security, enterprise architecture, or enterprise operations obstacle course that's actually required to get agents into production. What we find is the vast majority of people who are using agents today, limited as it is in the enterprise, is limited to kind of two audiences, primarily developers, and secondarily, we see some knowledge workers, data scientists in particular. Here's the problem is the developers may actually understand this, but most of the people that are thinking about agents do not understand what is required to get agents into production. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. The last myth is that coding agents are safe. I know everybody's thinking about probably in your firm, you're thinking about Claude Code, you're thinking about Codex, maybe even OpenClaw. If you're brave, you're probably using OpenClaw, for example, on your Mac Mini that you may have bought. If you're innovative, you're probably using Claude Code on your laptop or your workstation. And by the way, our entire team uses these tools every single day. We love Claude Code. We use Codex also. Bottom line is these things are incredibly useful, but in the enterprise context, they are not safe. I'll explain exactly why. In fact, in our discussions with security experts at various different firms and elsewhere, they are petrified about giving coding agents access to Bash, which means they effectively can do anything they want, or shell, and then giving them internet access. And then being able to access Salesforce and customer data at the same time they can access Gmail or otherwise. And being able to have that agent have access to both of those at the same time, we've seen some pretty serious and crazy stuff going on because these agents effectively have unbounded context and unbounded capabilities. If you want to get it into the enterprise, you have to think differently. And we think you have to seriously examine their architecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So those are the myths and the observations that we've actually seen. And that frames the dialogue that I want to have today here. So there's an aspiration that just about every company wants to get to. Today we have data, we have information. I think almost every enterprise that we've dealt with is well past the information phase, and they are driving real insights from their data. And they're starting to get to the point where they're moving from manual operations into a little bit more of an agentic or agent-enabled capability. However, where enterprises want to get to is they want to move beyond insights and into decisions and then actually into actions. How do I actually get this agent that has better insight, faster insight, perhaps even cheaper insight than most of the people in their organization? And how do I equip them, enable them to make the decisions and turn those decisions into action? That's where everybody wants to get to. And the business case, I'll talk a little bit about that later, is intuitively obvious. The bottom line is that's where we all want to get to, but we're not going to get there if we stay in our manual posture, or we dabble in agents, we dabble in coding agents or personal agents, and we move into the agent ecosystem where enterprise agents, those agents that are act, behave, and are treated like any other enterprise application, participate within the enterprise. So that's the framing around where we see organizations using agents. They want to move from transforming data into information and insights directly into decisions that are actionable. The question now is, how do you get there? So here's the challenge that we actually see is the agent tsunami is, whether it's hype, very soon turned into reality. The agent tsunami is coming. As I mentioned earlier, Jensen Huang, Satya Nadella, Andy Jassy have all said variations of this same thing. There's going to be hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe hundreds of millions of agents in every single enterprise. We started with chatbots, though, and I think they're very innovative, but there's not a lot of value that's being created as a result of these. However, they lay the groundwork for the next two where we do see some value. Coding agents, Claude Code, where we see software engineering being transformed. And as I mentioned earlier, we see data engineering following that same curve, albeit perhaps 6 to 9 months, maybe 12 months late. And we're starting to see personal agents, things like OpenClaw and the like, actually come into play, but they're more on the personal side, which means that the value arguably is going to be limited. The value equation says, though, when I can actually deploy agents safely in an ecosystem, that's when I'm going to get the tremendous value that Andy Jassy, Satya Nadella, and Jensen Huang are actually talking about. So where do we actually see agents? What are these million or so agents actually going to do? Well, the form factor, there's probably two. I'll talk about the first one. The first form factor is what we call smart data products. That's where we have data products. Again, I don't want to be pedantic on the definition, but a bounded context for data, whether it's in a data mart, data warehouse, set of tables, whatever the case may be, combined with agents. That's where we see the power. How? First, we see agents building smart data products. If you haven't already, you should try these. These coding agents are superb. This is Claude Code again, for example, are superb at building dbt pipelines. They're superb at invoking APIs and integrating APIs. They're superb at documentation, and they can actually do deployment workflows. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are at the early stages of what has happened to software engineering. We're going to see a revolutionize data engineering, all as a result of using agents to help build smart data products. What we actually see, though, is that's the starting point. what we see now starting to happen is people are starting to get smart about this and realizing that I can embed the agents and the intelligence into the data product and create conversational data products. Natural language interfaces are now here and available, which extend the reach and access of data to the business community. That is a big deal, and it's a simpler way to actually interact with your data. More importantly, though, what we find is the agents that are embedded in these data products, done well, can actually augment the data and drive the insights and the decisions and the actions based off of the data in the data product, thereby turning the data into knowledge and actually doing some real work. The last but not least is as we see agents being deployed into the enterprise, we see agents actually consuming these data products. And in fact, what they do is they consume it just like perhaps people would, except with one very particular difference, is they fill the agent context. And there's a fair amount of difference between how an agent will consume the data. They have a very limited context window, they call it. Leading edge models may have 1 million tokens that you can provide to the agent to help it do its job. But ultimately, where a person may not have that limitation as they use a BI product to access the data, an agent has some very strict limitations. But data products provide the foundation for addressing that very limited token aware, token budget aware context. So we actually see agents being built, data products being built upon an agentic backbone. And we'll talk a little bit what that looks like in a moment here. So first off, what does an agent, what are the characteristics of an agent? I mentioned earlier, and I want to differentiate this. I'm going to move to talk about the enterprise agents, those that participate in a business process, distinct from a coding agent or personal agent where that is guided explicitly by a person, where that agent takes upon the identity and inherits the permissions of that person. What we're talking about here with enterprise agents is that these things act, behave, and should be treated just like any other enterprise application. In other words, these agents are not attached to a user interface or a person. They have their own unique ID. They have their own set of permissions and capabilities that are specific to allowing them to do just the work that they actually need. So that's what I mean by an enterprise agent at a very high level. But there's a variety of characteristics that every one of these enterprise agents actually have. And I won't drain these, but there's a fair amount of these. If you've done anything in the enterprise operations or infrastructure space, these will resonate to you. Every agent needs to be discoverable, found by not just people, but also other agents. They need to be observable. We need to be able to understand what they're doing. So they need to emit the metrics appropriately. They need to be operable so that when they have a problem, they emit the alerts, the logs in the appropriate format so they can be plugged into the enterprise operations console. Agents must be zero trust and secure by default. Every agent has to have an identity, should be communicating using mutual TLS and OAuth, and has access only to the tools and skills that it is explicitly granted and are needed to do the job at hand. They need to be trusted. They should be certified. And we should be able to trust those certifications and look at those certifications on demand. Agents need to be reliable. And they need to be able to provide repeatable results. Agents need to be traceable. They need to be explainable. And they need to be conversational. If you think about how a business process works, and if we have now agents participating in that business process, we know that these agents are going to be talking for much longer periods of time than your typical microservice or typical interaction with an application. These conversations between multiple agents, for example, maybe they're doing a bank account open end to end, that may take, a day, a week, sometimes much longer than that. And we need to maintain the conversation amongst the agents and the state of the conversations over that long period of time. That is very different than many applications that are out there. But this is what it means to be an enterprise agent. Enterprise agents, as I mentioned, they collaborate with each other in what we call an ecosystem, but there needs to be services to support the ecosystem. First off, you need to have a marketplace. That's the user interface that makes it easy for people to find and engage agents. We need to have a registry that makes it easy for agents to find other agents and smart data products. There needs to be an interaction manager who manages that long-running conversation. There needs to be a trust authority that issues grants for those very time-limited or one-shot grants of permission to allow an agent to access a skill or access a tool. Then we need a tool executor that allows us to safely, once you have the grant, to execute and use that grant to actually do work. So we need a safe way of actually executing tools. MCP is one approach. We think there's some deficiencies, but that's a longer discussion. Suffice to say that we need a safe way to execute these tools. Of course, there's workbenches to create the capabilities that we talked about here. There's a creator workbench where you can make agents and smart data products. There's a trust workbench that allows you to define the policies that dictate what an agent can do and what tools and skills it can actually access. And of course, there's dashboards in the control plane along the way that helps you manage and operate these things at scale. I talked about agent identity as a core requirement. The reason I say that is because if you have identity, think of an agent identity as an employee ID. When you onboard an employee, the employee by default can't do anything. They don't have permissions to access any of the data or any of the applications. You need to bestow upon the employee the ability to actually execute the work that they need to do. So maybe you need to give them roles. Maybe you need to attach permissions. Agents are exactly the same. Agent identity is the fundamental building block upon which you build your security foundation for agents. Period, full stop. Everything else builds upon that. So, what does agent security actually look like, or agent identity? First off, you need to have the basics in place so that you can connect into an identity book of record. Any communications happens in an encrypted fashion using mutual TLS, for example. And you have OAuth 2 that allows you to pass bearer tokens to ensure that the communication partners are who they say they are. You have to start with a zero trust model. That's contrary to what Claude Code and Codex actually start with. Today, Claude Code, Codex, and OpenClaw, although we don't see that as much in the enterprise at all, but Claude Code and Codex by default are not zero trust. And in fact, they're pretty well the opposite of zero trust. They can access bash, which means they can or the shell, that means they can access your environment, they can access your file system. Given internet access, they can actually access other applications, and they can actually access properties outside of your enterprise. Today's agents are the exact opposite of zero trust, and that causes immense difficulty for your chief information security officer or even enterprise architect. Anybody who knows what they're getting into will have an allergic reaction to this type of stuff. So if you want to drive adoption, you need to think about a zero trust model. Every agent with an identity has to have an attached purpose and a set of policies. I think that's quite obvious. Every agent needs to be certified, and we have mechanisms to actually do certification at scale. Remember, we're not going to have one or two. We're going to have 1,000, 10,000, a million agents. Today's manual governance model will not work. It will not work. However, there are models out there to do governance at the scale of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of products out there. And you know what? We use them every single day. So our proposition is the model to federated governance is literally staring us in the face every time I lift up my toaster and I see the CSA logo, Canadian Standards Association logo. If I'm in the States, it's the Underwriters Laboratory. And you know, if you're in Europe, there's various different other standards organizations, but they have figured out how to create a distributed certification capability that allows us to be comfortable that my toaster is not going to burn my house down. And when we apply them to agents, that allows us to be confident that metaphorically the agent is not going to burn our data center down. So there are mechanisms to deal with certification or governance at scale, and we would propose not reinventing the wheel on this. Every agent with their identity, now we can attach traceability. What did that agent do? We can attach explainability. What was the agent thinking when it actually went about its plan and executed its plan? And of course, reliability is one of those things that are fundamental. Now, once I have an identity, I can actually have agents or smart data products participate in business processes. And in fact, with clients that we're working with, agents are full participants in business processes. They, for all intents and purposes, act like an employee. They have an agent identity, just like an employee has an employee identity. They have permissions, roles that are bestowed upon them that govern what they can or can't do. So we actually see the form factor for large agent ecosystems not to be, a haphazard structure. What we actually do see is the most prevalent and common way that agents being deployed at scale in enterprises is as they are as participants in a business process. Now, that causes a whole bunch of different constraints around security, some of which I've talked about. But it does give us a form factor that is actually well understood, but it works at agent speed, where traditional business processes have humans in the loop and humans actually governing the vast majority of the actual tasks that take place. Now the agents can do that work at agent speed. We have demos, for example, where we show a traditional agile-ish Kanban board that is moved by project managers and such. You can see that obviously the progress of that on a daily basis. And then we actually show the same business process with agents doing the work. And what you see is a Kanban board that is literally switching and changing second by second in real time. And that is an illustration, a very perfect illustration of the fact that when we see business processes augmented or even have full participation by agents, what we get is business processes that are executed at the agent speed. That is an incredible opportunity to change the way organizations are doing business. There's an intuitively obvious business case around better, faster, potentially cheaper, as agents actually become full participants in the business process. We see this today. We're working with clients to do this today. We see the benefits. However, these so-called smart data products or agents need data. Here's the challenge with data today. It's designed for human consumption, which means we may have things like SQL, we have Tableau or other BI products and capability. Microsoft has a whole suite of capability around these things, but they're designed for human consumption. They don't take into account the fact that we have this minimum buy or this context window, 1 million, typically a lot less tokens that you can bring to bear to the agent to help it do its job. But what we find is the need to identify that minimum viable context is a very different. There's a different process and there's different algorithms and there's a different approach that you need to consider to serve data to agents. The reason it's different, okay, is because it requires different mechanisms, different technology, although we want to leverage and we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but they're used in a different way, specifically to serve information or context in a token budget aware fashion. Now, all that being said, how do you do this in an effective way? We bundle this all under this terminology we call the Agentic Knowledge Fabric, which we're building for some clients. And there's 3 major components to it. The first one is semantics. So what we found is older techniques like RAG have not lived up to their promise. In fact, they don't scale. Once you get to give or take somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 to 50,000 entities in your vector database, what you really quickly find is, I think, what they call the curse of high dimensionality. Effectively, what happens is the similarity function that vector databases use do not detect similarities appropriately. So they run out of steam, they don't do their job. Instead, what we found is the older techniques that were popular 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of them came from library science, for example, around vocabularies, taxonomies, and ontologies, are a perfect fit for this, because what we end up doing is we end up adopting the semantics of the business. The semantics specifically being, we talk in the language of the concepts and objects that are important to a business. We talk about the policies that relate and the relationships between different concepts. Those can all be put into vocabulary taxonomies and, more importantly, ontologies. And that gives shape to the data in a way that is, first off, a little bit more intuitive for people, but it's also much more intuitive for the agents. As you probably know, they talk natural language, and they prefer things like markdown documents, almost human readable type documents. So the techniques that fell out of favor 10 years ago, give or take, are now finding their way back. Semantics is the key, and they are the secret to actually finding the right content, and actually prioritizing that content for this minimal viable context. Of course, there's storage. So what we're seeing is the natural way to actually capture semantics, store semantics, are things like knowledge graphs, network of entities linked by typed relationships. And of course, there's probably going to be indices and metadata that need to be managed similarly. And of course, there's retrieval mechanics that you need to think through. Each of the techniques, knowledge graphs, managing metadata, indexing, all those are common techniques, I think, today. So I won't dwell too much on them. But the last thing I want to say about this, though, is the efficacy of the data is predicated on not just the structured data that we all know and love. When I see, when I talk to clients, typically what they think about when they serve their agents, they're thinking about, how do I get the information out of my relational database, Postgres, the cloud, or what have you. And we think that is just one arguably important, but actually tiny piece of the semantic puzzle that we're trying to put together. In fact, what we find is we have data sources as the bottom right-hand box there. The other 9 to the left of them are as important, if not more important in sometimes. So what we find is things like standard operating procedures are rich repositories that explain exactly how a business runs, how a business process operates. We find that interviews with experts and capturing those transcripts provides a wealth of information. In fact, it unlocks the tacit information that is stuck in these experts' brains that is so hard to extract. Things like audio and video coming out of your contact center, immensely valuable. Of course, source code is helpful. When you're thinking about documenting requirements, I think everybody's gone through project requirement phase. Some version of that has probably been adapted as people adopt modern development techniques. Nevertheless, the documents that you perhaps created 2-3 years ago for a project that at the time worked very well, helped you build that and deliver that project, but has never been seen since or used since, are incredible repositories of information around how a business works, how an application works. And within there, we find tremendous sets of articulation of some of the business concepts and the relationships between the policies that govern them. Same thing with email, Slack, and even industry and government regulatory documents. These are all of the knowledge sources that make your agent smarter, better, faster than your competitors. So lesson learned here is, we call it the Agentic Knowledge Fabric, to definitively differentiate it from what is traditionally viewed as, whether it's a vector database or accessing information from your relational database and giving it to the agent. We think there's tremendous opportunity to do things differently. We bundle all that under this thing we call the Agentic Knowledge Fabric. Now, the interesting thing about this is I've highlighted a lot about what's in the Agentic Knowledge Fabric and the fact that we need to organize it well and that we need to have good retrieval techniques. The thing is, what I want to highlight is there's a way to actually capture this information and then serve it for agents in this minimal viable context, this token-aware fashion. We built these things before, but they are not simple to execute well. So when you think about this, let me kind of explain how we do this and why we chose to do the pieces of the puzzle as you see it here on the screen. The first step, obviously, is ingestion. It's all those data sources on the previous slide at the bottom. I'll line them up vertically, but that is the raw data that you want to have that ultimately will find its way in one shape, form, or another, perhaps reformatted, in the Agentic Knowledge Fabric. With the ingestion, what we try and do is segregate it, and this is, I'm dramatically simplifying this, but we separate it into data products or concepts or business entities, a lot of different words for the same thing, and data contracts. And the data contracts provide a variety of different things. They in many cases will link different data products or objects or entities, but they also provide business rules for those things. Maybe the invoice should only be processed straight through if it's less than $1,000. If it's greater than $1,000, it has to go for subsequent levels of approval. These business rules are implemented as data contracts. And what happens is we compile those things together into what we call concept cards and policy cards, and they're stored in the Agentic Knowledge Fabric. Then, now that we have this information stored, what we then do is we actually serve it to the agent. So an agent comes with a request. That request gets matched to a skill, for example. And in that skill, what we do is we find the capability and how it's supposed to be executed, probably references a bunch of different tools that are required to fulfill this. And of course, there's the opportunity to have a tool to go and actually get the information. So we have a context server that takes that information, decomposes it, identifies the concepts and the policies that are stored within the Agentic Knowledge Fabric, identifies the relevant ones, prioritizes them, and provides the top level priorities to in a filtered fashion to achieve what we call the minimum viable context. And that is actually what is served to the agent. So that is the end-to-end process around how ultimately the Agentic Knowledge Fabric is consumed and how the agents actually use and consume that Agentic Knowledge Fabric to facilitate requests in a token-aware fashion. So that's a relatively complex chart. There's actually a lot more to it than this, but at a high level, this is the process that we follow time and time again. Now, let me bring all this together and just begin my closing here. A lot of the pieces on the slide here, we've already talked about. We've talked about smart data products in the middle. Obviously, there's a communication fabric that binds all these together. We find, for example, we don't use HTTP terribly often for a lot of different reasons, but we do use a pub-sub type network, so Kafka, NATS, message queue type products. We find are much more amenable to these long-running conversations that we actually need to have. So the communication fabric is common and consistent across all the data products, would have a global namespace. But ultimately, this allows all of our data products, our smart data products, again, agents, to communicate with each other. They are built into the form factor for this agentic process automation. And then we have the bookends that I mentioned, the development capability and the operations capability. On the bottom, we have the Agentic Knowledge Fabric, that context serving capability. And on the top, we have some of the other components that I've probably only glossed over, but in obviously Agentic process management or automation, we have a process manager, we have a registry, we have a trust authority, and the tool executor. So if you're looking for the agent-enabled smart data product ecosystem, the agent ecosystem, what we call the agentic mesh, this is what it is on one slide. This is what we are implementing today with our clients. And what we're finding is it allows us and our clients to actually leverage and use agents at scale, which is, of course, the objective that we have, that our clients have, and that's where they actually see the value actually accruing. So that's the end of my presentation. If you want to learn more, just take a look at the QR code here. You'll find it shows you our link tree, which shows you how to access our Substack, our YouTube channel. We also have our podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as how to reach out to me on LinkedIn. So with that in mind, I've talked for just about 45 minutes. I will pause and open it up for questions.
Eric, I think we have a couple of questions in the chat. Are you able to look into the chat, or do you want me to?
Let me see if when I'm presenting the screen, it limits my options. So I'm going to have to ask you to read them to me if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Perfect. So we have a couple of questions all from Joe. So question number one is, what place will OpenClaw and its components have in the corporate agent marketplace?
Sure. Joe, you may not like my answer. What we find is things like OpenClaw are interesting and useful, but they're really geared towards personal use. Um, That being said, like Claude Code, like Codex, you can instrument these things to play safely within an enterprise ecosystem. You need to think about all the things I talked about here, the agent identity, being able to control tool execution. You need to dramatically reduce the capability and access rights that OpenClaw may have. So can be done. We don't see a lot of enterprises actually doing that. We see a lot of a lot of Claude Code. We see a lot of Codex, and of course Microsoft Copilot, I suppose. But we see a lot of that adoption of those, but we don't see OpenClaw adoption at this point in time. That may be an indicator that perhaps those enterprises, maybe I'm wrong about this, but that's the lay of the land as we see it right now.
Okay. The next question is how to find clients as a contract forward engineer.
How to find clients. So I'm going to assume that is part of the discovery process. If I interpret this wrong, Joe, please just let me know. As I mentioned, there's in order for an agent ecosystem to work, there has to be a way for them to find each other and collaborate. Discovery is a fundamental capability. So in the old days, we had APIs. There's API discovery capability. Same thing for data products and data product discovery. Same thing for agents. An agent needs to be, first off, when it has its identity, it needs to be registered into a registry, the book of record for agent information, if you will. Once it's in there, then it's trivial. I shouldn't say trivial. It's not difficult, or it's not rocket science to make that registry queryable and accessible by people, as
Thank
well
you.
as other agents.
Thank you, Eric. I was actually hoping to refer to how do we as human beings find new customers. In the States, there's a new AI role referred to as forward engineer, which essentially means the person who makes the agent work with the business rules.
And the question is, how do we
connect? How do we find corporate customers for that work?
So is the question, if I'm a forward deployed engineer, how do I find work? Is that what you mean, Joe?
Yes. How do we find customers as contract AI IT workers?
Well, I would say that it's hard work and it's a lot of elbow grease. The best way that I find to actually find work, I'm in that bucket. We've grown this company from myself into, we have 6 or 7 employees depending on the workload now. Hard work. What we do is we first off experiment a lot with these, and then we talk a lot about this or write a ton about this, whether it's LinkedIn, Substack. Tell people what you know. Participate in open source projects. Build demos. Make them available on GitHub. There's nothing quite like real experience, demonstrable experience that a client wants to see when they want to actually engage a contractor. So it's probably the same thing that I would have said as a data professional 10 years ago, exactly the same thing. There's no rhyme or reason or magic. But what I would say is that the tools at your disposal, Claude Code and otherwise, allow you to build such cool capabilities so quickly and easily. If you have an idea and you can get it out there, um, I think it's going to be a lot easier to impress clients to demonstrate your skills and capability.
Thanks. I think one challenge is finding the right person in a corporation to talk to and to know what to present them with. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the right person is the person who has a problem. So there's a little bit of consulting 101, I suppose, but if you're looking to reach out to a senior executive, you have to have a very compelling business problem that you are an expert with and you have a unique value proposition that allows you to solve that problem in a different, faster, better, cheaper way than anyone else. So if you're pitching at the senior executive level, that's what you need to do. That's the table stakes. If you're pitching at the director or senior manager level or below, at that point in time, obviously it goes without saying that your network is important. You should obviously continue to build that. That's obvious, perhaps. This is where, but if you're pitching at somebody that you don't know, there's nothing quite like saying, hey, don't believe me what I'm saying here on LinkedIn. Take a look at this open source repository that I built or this cool application that I built. I used Claude Code, I used Codex, I used OpenClaw, and demonstrate your capability. That works wonders.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I've got a few more in there. I don't think anyone else asked any questions, but
Sure.
my additional questions. You mentioned manual governance will not work, and I was wondering, does that mean, for example, that humans won't be writing group policy in Active Directory, or what? How is the governance going to be done?
Yeah, sure. There's 2 parts of governance. One is the policy making, and the other one is the policy policing. Pardon the alliteration. Policy making is fundamental, but that once you do that, once you enact a policy, it doesn't change regularly or frequently unless there's something in the business climate that forced a change. So there's always a role for policy making, but that's not a big group. And it's relatively slow moving and it reacts to slow moving events. That's not going to change. However, the other piece of that is ensuring that the agents, in our case, have actually adopted the policy and that I can actually verify that they did. Traditional governance is very manual in that regard. Yes, there's some automation to it, but it's very manual in that regard. And if I have, 10 databases or, 6 or 7 data warehouses or 50 applications that rarely change, maybe I can tolerate a manual exercise. Maybe I can go to the architecture review board, once a quarter, or anytime I want to make some changes, which are relatively slow moving. When you have 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or a million of anything, we're talking about something completely different. Very few organizations manage 100,000 of anything at all, except for customers. And oh, by the way, we have huge organizations to manage and govern the customer information and the customer stuff and the products and the interactions. So if you have 100,000 or a million of anything, most organizations are not prepared to govern the policing aspect, not the policy making, the policing aspect, or the observing and ensuring that they're following the policies in an appropriate fashion. However, you can't do that manually. You just don't have enough people to actually manage that amount of agents. Second of all, these agents are working at agent speed, not people speed. So you can't manage something that's moving 10 times as fast as people by, relatively slow compared to agents, people. So you need to revamp how you do governance. And the model that we've seen is it has to be federated and it has to be distributed, and you have to actually delegate the authority to the lowest level in the organization that you're comfortable with. And their responsibility is to ensure that the policies that are made at the top of the house are actually enacted and enforced. So it's a different model. Again, I emphasize Canadian Standards Association, rather. Underwriters Lab manage literally tens of millions, billions of instances of products every single day.
Thanks. I had a similar question about the same thing for business processes done by agents.
Mm-hmm.
And also, how can we best follow agent developments and find educational resources?
Well, I would say that there's literally a cornucopia of information out there. LinkedIn, X, Medium, Substack, all of which have immense amounts of useful information. For example, our Substack, we publish one or sometimes two in-depth articles on agent security, on agentic process automation, on the agentic knowledge fabric. These are all based off of it in our Substack, based on our experience. So we're broadcasting what we know, because we think it's important to give back to the community, but it's also an opportunity to demonstrate our competency and capability. So the resources that I would actually start with is Substack. And the reason I say that is my experience with LinkedIn is it's becoming very crowded with AI slop, AI generated stuff that doesn't add a ton of value. Whereas Substack, there's still what I would characterize as a very high level of pride of ownership. So the material I find on Substack are probably the top. That's where I would go to get my information about this domain. Second would be Medium, and then distant third would probably be LinkedIn. But again, as I mentioned earlier, if you listen to LinkedIn, it seems like everybody's doing agents and you're like a mile behind. Not in fact the case. There's just a little too much hype on LinkedIn. Nevertheless, it does have some useful things.
Thank you. We've got a couple other questions from other people, but also, have you encountered any clients who allow agents to create business processes as opposed to carry them out?
Yeah, we do. In fact, it's so I'm not here to pitch a product in any way, shape, or form. But for those that are interested, we've been capturing all of our learnings, and we're going to be open sourcing something in about the 2-month time frame. If you're interested, just reach out to me on LinkedIn or otherwise. Um, uh, we have the ability to, from a technical specification, you can actually generate a business process, the tasks, and you can actually identify the what the task is supposed to do, the skills and the tools it's supposed to use, all automatically from a spec. We think that is the way that people will be designing business processes at scale. They will not be, managing icons on a screen. Um, so we see if you want to do this well, you have to think differently. The interesting thing about these specs is they're created by agents too, based off of some questions and a little bit of interaction with people. So we can get business processes generated in a very, very short period of time and have them operational very, very quickly. So that's the kind of stuff that we actually are seeing and we're implementing with clients as we speak.
Do humans review the resulting spec before it's implemented?
Absolutely. Now, here's what I would say is if you take a look at the spec at when somebody is designing a business process, 10 years ago, the spec, here's the problem with the human designed process is you spend all of your time traversing the happy path. What happens when everything works? And the problem with, RPA, robotic process automation, or the older business process automation tools, is the happy path worked, maybe 90% of the time, but you spent all of your time on the 10% of the time that you didn't plan the edge cases. So what we found is that that process is flawed and has given business process management a very bad name. What we find with agents is the agents are able to deal with the ambiguity and given appropriate guidance in that spec can actually deal with virtually all of the edge cases in an intelligent fashion, just like a person would. So what we see is there's different ways. If you think differently and truly think about what agents can and can't do, what you're going to find is new opportunities by doing things quite differently and radically different. And we find that actually pays significant dividends. There's a few other questions. Oh, sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah,
I do want to give other people an opportunity to ask questions too, if there are some.
We have few questions in the chat. So first one is from Harry. Where do you see Microsoft Foundry in the industry since they also have the OpenAI partnership, so Pilot, Azure Cloud, Identity, and desktop apps? Do they have a dominant lead?
I don't see anyone having a dominant lead today. If anybody's leading, it's Anthropic with Claude Code and the infrastructure and capability built around that. So we see infrastructure surrounding the agent ecosystem, but there's no dominant player today. And in fact, I would argue that the landscape is changing and shifting so quickly that what you see today may not necessarily be viable a year from now. So I think despite the fact that you may read a lot of marketing literature around this company or that company having a really cool and exciting product, what you need to understand is the only thing that's constant and consistent here is change. And you need to think a little bit about how I can be flexible as I deploy some of this capability. Avoid the lock-in if at all possible. Easier said than done, perhaps, but it pays dividends. So keep your flexibility and make bets that give you some degree of control over the decisions that you want to make vis-a-vis vendor products.
The next question is from Jean. Should we consider data mesh as another data engineering architecture?
I'm obviously biased. I wrote a book about data mesh. So let me tell you what is actually happening. So data mesh today is more of an operating concern, an operating model than it is an implementation. There's no reference implementation. There's no products per se that do data mesh. However, what we found is that the pieces underneath the covers, data products, data contracts, are thriving. So data mesh is built off of a whole bunch of different concepts, among them data products and data contracts. There's standards now for data contracts, Open Data Contract Standard, ODCS. Same thing for data products, Open Data Product Standard, ODPS. And there's vendor offerings that actually implement these things. I've seen a bunch of them. I'm working with some of the folks that are doing these things. So what I would say is this is the implementation of data mesh is being decomposed into its constituent parts, but the operating model, the notion of federated data management capability is alive and well in data mesh, but it's an operating model, not an implementation. What we see with with agents is when you actually combine agents and data products and data contracts, you get that smart data product. And when you combine that with a communication fabric, you do now actually have an implementation of an agent ecosystem. We call that agentic mesh. We're starting to see products from vendors like OpenAI, like Anthropic, like well, a variety of others. I won't go through all the names here, but we're starting to see the ability to have reference implementations, open source implementations of meshes of agents. Again, our proposition is we call it agentic mesh, but we also believe that the form factor is the agentic business process or agentic process automation. We're starting to see a fair amount of companies actually land on that same perspective.
Um, the next question is from Harry as well. Do you think orchestrated agentic AI will be a big area of activity the next few years?
Absolutely. The whole idea around orchestrated AI or orchestrated agents, we think is fundamental to them expanding their reach in the enterprise. So when I think of orchestration, I think of collaboration, and you need to think about what is the form factor for that collaboration. So if you're talking about coding agents, what you're talking about is orchestration in a minimalist or local fashion. So Cloud Code Codex, you can launch swarms, to use that term, of agents on your local machine, and they will actually help you build software and do a variety of other cool things. That is orchestration, but it's in the local context. And that's perfectly okay, by the way. There's nothing wrong with that. However, that is what we think of orchestration in the small or in the local sense. The broader opportunity with orchestration is around agentic process automation, because that is the natural way of doing work in an enterprise. And it's the natural way to assign agents to that work. We call that the task as the unit of work. So what we see is the unit of orchestration at the enterprise level is actually process automation, or in our case, agentic process automation. And that's where we see huge opportunities. And we think that's the next form factor for agents in the enterprise. So yes, huge opportunity for orchestration, both in the local level, in the small, or in the large, in the enterprise.
Sounds good. I don't think so. We have any other questions in the chat. If anyone has any question, please feel free to unmute and we can ask directly to Eric.
Eric, are we past the corporate fear from the Air Canada lawsuit?
Um, I think fear is healthy in a way. In a way, it's healthy because it forces you to think not about the happy path, but rather about the things that you may not know or understand, and ensure that you have an environment, an infrastructure capability that is secure and safe. So a little bit of corporate fear is healthy. Taken to extremes, fear can slow down the innovation process. We don't want any of that happening. But what we find is that most enterprises, one, they see the immense value. And the question is not how do I stop it, but how do I go fast, but how do I do it safely? Every enterprise we talk to, that's exactly the words that we see. I've never seen a single enterprise that says, I want to stop my agent stuff because you know what, I heard there was a blow up at company X or company Y. Every single company that we deal with recognizes the opportunity and wants to move fast, but they do not want to move recklessly. So I would characterize that as healthy, a little bit of healthy fear. It's keeping companies on their toes, and it makes them think proactively around how to do things safely and securely. That's what we actually see happening. We don't see any company slowing down as a result of these potential issues that you may see in the news or otherwise. Um, if anything, it forces them to say, I recognize the business value. I want to now invest in agent or AI security capability. So it's actually, I think, at least at this point in time, it is actually generating the right behavior to allow us to move fast, but move fast safely.
Thanks. Are hallucinations under control enough to allow financial transactions with agents?
Let me preface that a little bit. There's a lot of talk about agents and AI hallucinations. In my context, the people who are doing the business processes today, we don't call them hallucinations, we call them mistakes. I won't give you a specific example, but I'll give you a general one. Opening a bank account at a very well-established bank can take up to 40 days, despite the fact that the people are very well trained, they're extremely smart, extremely competent, but they make mistakes. And quite common to have to, sign multiple documents over again, having to have multiple interviews, multiple dialogues. And by the way, I'm not talking about opening a simple checking account, opening up an investment account or a foreign exchange account. Something that's a modest level of complexity. Despite the best efforts and training of organizations, the people in them are, to use a turn of phrase, they're non-deterministic. So they're not called hallucinations, they're called mistakes when they do it. Here's the difference is today, agents and AI are better at math than any human out there today. They've solved math problems that we have not been able to solve for decades. They can do the law exam, the medical exam, and they can get higher marks than any human today. So they're not perfect. But here's what I would argue is the bar is not perfection. The bar is, can they do better and then maybe faster and then maybe cheaper than the alternatives out there? And today, with rare exceptions, and I'll talk about those in a second, the answer is yes, they can do it better. Here's where I would not use it. Obviously, military use, you need to be extremely careful. Anthropic has had a very well publicized battle with the US government. I won't weigh into that. You can read it on that and you can make your own determination. But let me tell you what happened where I would not be comfortable having an agent make decisions, and that's in healthcare. By the way, that's not to say that doctors shouldn't use agents. In fact, I've run into a few doctors where they say, these agents that we have help me transcribe the interviews and discussions with my patients. And normally I would do that at the end of the day. And now at the end of the day, I can't remember all the things I talked about, but with the capability of the AI to not only transcribe, but summarize the discussions with the patients, they are better equipped to do what they need to do. That's perfectly okay. In fact, I welcome a situation where a doctor can take care of the administrivia better, faster, cheaper than they could otherwise, so they can spend more time with their patients. What I would not want to do is have a agent today make a decision around, should I have this type of surgery or not? That is a decision that I think I need to have a human accountable participant, a doctor who is accountable for that decision, a doctor who knows me better than any agent may be able to. That's where I think I would personally draw the line. Will that line change in the future? Maybe, but today, where I need direct accountability, where very, very important decisions are made, that's where I'd want to have a human in the loop. Another example, payments. There's a lot of activity around having agents actually execute payments. What my perspective is, I work in the payments area quite a bit. I would not let agents do payments right now. The reason I say it is by the way, it's very different to have an agent do a $100 transaction on your Visa is compared to a $10 million money transfer across the SWIFT network in multiple banks. That's where I would draw the line today because the cost of a mistake and the agents will make mistakes, just not as frequently as people do. And there's a lot of people error in the payments process that just doesn't get talked about. But here's the thing is the cost of that error may still be a little high for me. But I think, that probably is going to change in 2 years. So for the most part, I think the hallucinations is a problem that we're well past, and that the opportunity by agents to be competitive with other non-deterministic things we call people is available today.
Anyone has any other questions? We have about 15 minutes left.
I have a question about skill set for process automation. Software engineers don't have the skill set to do business processes. So what skill set do you see people bringing to the table to do that? If you're going to do orchestrated, you have to have a process definition.
Yeah, so so there's first a few things I would say is these agents are trained with a wealth of information, including business processes. Now, they're generalized business processes. They may not be business processes that are specific to your enterprise, but out of the gate, I'll use the software engineering example. There's a pretty well defined software delivery process that, if you're using Git or GitHub and some of the CI/CD type capability, there's a process that's very well understood, documented outside the industry. And if you're adopting generalized processes, the agents and the LLMs have them today. Don't underestimate that. They even understand generalized payment processes, for example, or generalized document ingestion. However, the power of the agents can also help you dramatically remove the barriers to understanding the actual business process that may be specific or unique to your business or a group within your business. One of the things that we found extremely powerful is simple things like looking at overlooked documentation, standard operating procedures, the requirements for a project that nobody actually has looked at in 2 years has huge amounts of information. The opportunity to talk to business experts, transcribe that, and make sense of that is extremely powerful, and it's available at your fingertips. So what I would say is that for the software engineer, what used to be very, very difficult to do with modern tools like Claude Code or Cowork or otherwise is now well within reach. And every software engineer or every data engineer should be exploring that capability today.
Thank you.
Any other questions by anyone?
Eric, if I'm selling to a CIO and the CIO brings up the MIT study saying 90% of AI products fail and that there's a ROI crisis, what do I say to him about showing that there will be a return on investment?
Sure. First thing I would say is that study has been debunked 9 ways from Sunday. It is a phony baloney study. And you can look it up on the internet, 9 ways from Sunday, what mistakes they made. They only talked to a limited audience. They asked limited questions, and they made up's the wrong word. They engineered the outcome to be as explosive as they possibly could, and of course, it worked. My suggestion is get some hands-on experience, demonstrate what you can and can't do. Anybody who's worked with Claude Code for even an hour recognizes what it can do and how it can actually, what the actual opportunities are available to you. You're only limited by your own imagination. So here's what I would say. There's a lot of studies out there that will, say, among other things, they're clickbait, and people naturally get attached to outrage. But here's the things that we're seeing out there, and why I'm absolutely confident is things around software engineering, people used to say that, this would be, a job exodus for software engineers. The demand for software engineers has increased well in excess of what people actually anticipated. It's higher than it was before COVID. So despite the fact that we have tools that can make us all, as software engineers, for example, 10 times more productive, has only driven demand to create new and innovative capabilities. So what I would say is look at the studies in an objective fashion, and you'll have to make your own judgment. But there's more than enough nonsense out there that I would stick to the more reputable sources. That MIT one, I know exactly which one you're talking about, has been debunked so many times that just be careful which ones you actually look at.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, I don't think so. We have any other questions. Also, we have very few minutes left. I would be stopping the recording.
Perfect. So just one quick comment. Feel free